Hello and welcome to everyone tuning in from home. Thank you so much for joining us for this exciting event. I'm Audrey Sands, Norton Family Assistant Curator of Photography at the Center for Creative Photography, a joint appointment with the Phoenix Art Museum. Before we begin today's program, I want to share a few acknowledgements. First, we respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. Before turning over my conversation with Rich Frishman, I'd like to send a warm thank you to our CCP Directors Circle and CCP members whose support makes programs like this possible. If you'd like to learn more about joining us as a member or sponsor our work in other ways, please visit our website at ccp.arizona.edu. And now for our program, Ghosts of Segregation with Rich Frishman. Today's program is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Freedom Must Be Lived, Marion Palfi's America, 1940 to 1978, organized by the Center for Creative Photography and on view at Phoenix Art Museum through January 2nd, 2022. It is intended to foster dialogue around the issues raised by Palfi's work and to provide a lens into contemporary photographic practice focused on the legacy of the civil rights movement and social justice activism through the visual arts. Today, I am incredibly grateful to be joined by Rich Frishman, an acclaimed artist and deeply thoughtful historian. He is joining us from Richmond, Virginia, where he is currently making new work. Rich Frishman's photographs explore the impact of the built environment on cultural histories. Born and raised in Chicago, Frishman studied with photographic artists Reed Estabrook, Robert Flick, and Art Sensabaugh at the University of Illinois. Frishman lectures around the US about the intersection of the designed environment, history, and social issues. Rich has won numerous international awards, and his work is in a number of museum collections nationwide, including the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and the Amon Carter Museum. Among his many prestigious grants and awards are a Leonian Grant, the Curator's Choice Award from Review Santa Fe, a Photo NOLA Portfolio Review Award, 2 Sony World Photography Awards, a Communication Arts Photography Award, and he has been a finalist in Photo Lucida's Critical Mass competition 3 times. He was also nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 1983 for feature photography. Today, Rich will be speaking about his ongoing series, Ghosts of Segregation. In this ongoing project, Frishman explores the vestiges of segregation, slavery, and institutionalized racism as seen in America's built environment. Since 2018, Frishman has traversed the country, photographing formerly segregated theater entrances, schools, saloons, and neighborhoods, as well as historic sites of racialized violence or civil rights significance. Each picture in his series is composed of hundreds of separate overlapping photographs, which he later stitches together to produce highly detailed and immersive prints. This body of work has garnered international acclaim in the past couple years. Most notably, Rich was awarded a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship this past spring to complete Ghosts of Segregation, under the auspices of which he is currently crisscrossing the country to make his final photographs. And the series was written up in a beautifully illustrated piece in the New York Times last fall. A selection of works from the project is currently traveling as a 36 print exhibition. It is currently on display at the Lawrence Art Center in Lawrence, Kansas. And in spring of 2023, it will be on view at the Center for Disease Control Museum in Atlanta. Ghosts of Segregation will also be released as a trade book in December 2022 by Celadon Books, an imprint of Macmillan Publishers. Wow. With all of that going on, we are especially grateful for your time. Welcome, Rich. Thank you so much for joining us. I will turn the floor over to you now.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be speaking in conjunction with the great work that Marion Palfi did and that you're presenting. I'd like to tell you, before I get into the pictures, a little bit about the premise of my documentary work. It's pretty simple. I believe that history is all around us, no matter where we live, and it's a variety of history which can instruct us, inform us, and remind us of where we've been, and be a marker to help guide us to where we're going. I believe I'm focused on the built environment because I believe that our society's true attitudes, priorities, prejudices are most honestly revealed in our built environment, not in the stories we tell about ourselves. We may be honest. I mean, I'll speak for myself, okay? I can be honest in revealing who I am, but I'll be selective and omit a few things. So what I write, what I say may not be as fully true of who Rich Frishman is. Some of what I present may be true. Most of it will be. Some of it will be informative, and a fair amount of it might be amusing. But I'll omit things because of shame or guilt, and we do that on a societal level. So that is why I focus my documentary work on the built environment. And I think it just gives us a truer picture. It's our society's autobiography. So I'm going to move on now to discuss some actual pictures. This scene, this illustrates a point that is true in much of my work. It is that we look at the world around us and we make assumptions of what it is that we're seeing. This looks like a rather bucolic spot. Those benches are backless though, so not too comfortable. Maybe it's a front lawn. That shade tree could offer some comfort. We don't know what that building is in back. Eventually, I'll tell you all about these things, but the question is, what do you see? Because when we are looking around at our own everyday environment, we have to pierce through that veil of banality to discover what's underneath. What do you see here? Looking at this scene, if you were walking down the street and you stopped and saw this, what sort of assumptions would you make and what evidence might you find? I see a pretty heavy-duty security light and what looks like a security camera and possibly a burglar alarm. But look above the light and you see stained glass. What might you think this is? Now, I can look at this picture, I think, oh, good, ice cream, and have a rather nostalgic view of this scene. And I can also think of Edward Hopper, one of the great influences in my life. Now, let's look at what these pictures really are. These benches in Notasulga, Alabama, were the initial site for the Tuskegee syphilis study. On these benches, men would sit every month for 30 years to have their blood drawn by Nurse Eunice Rivers. It changes how we perceive that bucolic, this bucolic scene. This is the doorway through which Dylan Roof passed in 2017 at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He walked through these doors and killed 9 people. The profundity of what we're looking at is often elusive, but it is instructional. Now, I can look at this and have a nostalgic view because I have the privilege of being white. A Black person my age, especially one who grew up in the South, would look at this and immediately know what they were seeing. That little window off to the right was once the colored window. Black people would have to stand there and wait till there were no white customers before they could order. The owners of the restaurant, of the drive-in, told me that they maintained this. It's never been a drive-up window. They've maintained it as a reminder. If we forget where we have been, I was told, we can get lost again. What is this? When we first look at it, it's ambiguous, completely ambiguous. This is the window through which James Earl Ray shot Martin Luther King. Often the sites of racial animus, ethnic animus are completely enigmatic. There may be nothing left to actually see, but I still feel that in those sites is encapsulated a bit of the people who passed through there. And in this site, Matthew Shepard was killed outside Laramie, Wyoming, because he was gay. Infrastructure is another example of how we enforce segregation. Looking at this scene, you might just enjoy the abstraction of the moving lights, but what I'm seeking to depict is how the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago was situated to form a boundary barrier between the white community of Bridgeport, which would be on the left in this picture, and the growing Black Belt community on the right. It happens that when the Dan Ryan was being sited, the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, lived in Bridgeport. And highways are a major way of enforcing infrastructure everywhere, and also tamping down on whole communities. This year, we mourned the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre. After that thriving middle-class community of Greenwood, a neighborhood of Tulsa, after it was completely leveled, it began to sprout up again, and highways were built over it, more humble than what we're seeing here. But each time the community would try and rebuild, they were further tamped down. Now we have an Interstate 244 passing right over what once was the heart of Greenwood. Enforcing this sort of segregation is also a function of what we used to call redlining. And it isn't like redlining has gone away. It's just gone underground, or it's called other things. In this case, this is in Detroit, a developer was seeking to build a development for middle-class white people. It adjoined a middle-class Black neighborhood. And in order to expedite the ability to get loans by those white people, he built a half-mile-long wall as a barrier. And that wall, now colorfully decorated by a more broadly minded community, still stands. Another wall. We do build a lot of walls, don't we? When I shot this in 2016, unbeknownst to me, about 1,500 Mexican children were being held in an abandoned or Walmart about 5 miles from here. I returned 2 years ago, and about 5 miles from this spot in Matamoros, there were thousands of Central American refugees seeking to escape the violence of the drug cartels and political violence by coming to the United States and living through COVID in a very crowded camp. Now, the history of our racial animus and our segregation patterns are not usually this easy to perceive. Macon, Georgia, controversially decided to keep this part of their transit hub, which dated back to the 20s, as a history lesson. When these places are gone, I ask myself, who does it benefit when we are confronting something like this? Is the removal of that sign, colored waiting room, assuaging the pain of the victims? Or is it covering up the embarrassment that the victimizers might feel? It's a complex process. And I am in Richmond now. I just this afternoon was at the empty plinth where the Robert E. Lee statue once stood. I don't know what the answers are, but if people are in pain, especially if those people are victims, that's one more reason to remove that iconography. And if it's just the victimizers who are embarrassed, I don't think that's such a good idea. Anyhow, my little political rant. This is another example, a rare example that speaks to our difficult and tortured racial history. Oh, I should say, just an anecdote, this, when I was photographing this scene, I had to work my way through some cyclone fencing, and I was fully engaged in what I was shooting when I heard a voice close behind me, just on the other side of that cyclone fence. It was a high voice saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." It turned out to be a 90-year-old woman named Holiday Stone. She had been born here and still lived in the community, and saw that the building was decaying and soon would be gone. And she wanted it to be remembered for what it was. This is an enigmatic partial sign. Change. It's rather poetic. This is the last vestige of the New Orleans slave exchange in the heart of the French Quarter. And through many iterations and remodelings, this much was saved. This is, for my work, unusual because it is so iconic, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think that practically everybody would know what they're seeing when they look at this arching bridge. And I certainly tried to make it dramatic and compelling to make people stop. But my purpose is to get us to learn the history of these places. I would imagine that while everybody might recognize this as the Edmund Pettus Bridge, only a portion, a large number, would remember Bloody Sunday, which occurred here. The 600 marchers that were crossing from Selma to go to Mobile were confronted by Mississippi State Police and badly beaten. The effect of that was the most profound because this was televised and seen nationally and caused an uproar among otherwise somewhat disconnected public. Seeing dogs attacking people and people being beaten helped propel the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Had it not been for those brave people crossing this bridge, that would not have happened at that time. This Clark's Cafe in Huntington, Oregon, I had targeted this to photograph it several years ago, but I didn't get there until about 1 year ago. And I had made some assumptions. When I'd seen this on Flickr, I thought all white help, it's another Jim Crow thing. When I arrived, I discovered two things. One, the building that it was an exterior wall for had been burned in an arson just a week before. And the all white help sign was an indication of animus, not towards African Americans, because in Huntington, Oregon, at the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries, there weren't African Americans, but there were about 200 Chinese people who would first come to help build the railroad, stayed to do mining, and they were the ones being discriminated against. So a week after I left here, because of that arson, the wall disappeared. It had to be removed because it was no longer structurally sound. This sort of ephemeral nature of our built environment is much on my mind, and it's one of the reasons that I try and photograph what exists while it exists. As in the case of Matthew Shepard's murder scene, I was too late. I was too late for this. This was the remains of a Rosenwald School. And in much of the South, Rosenwald schools were the primary source of education for Black children. Julius Rosenwald, in conjunction with Booker T. Washington, created a foundation, the Rosenwald Foundation, to build schools to educate Black children across the rural South. And by the time that program ended in 1947, it ran from 1917 to 1947. About 6,000 schools had been built. At this point, there's only about 60 structures that remain. The history of our prejudice, our animus, our racism is not just past tense. Everybody must realize that. This is current events, and I'm trying to bring that home in some of the work that I'm doing now. This was one of 4 churches in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, that were torched by an arsonist, Black churches, in 2019, in the spring of 2019. When I was there photographing, one of the parishioners, a gentleman about my age named Ernest Hines, told me that when he heard the news, all he could think about was the 16th Street Baptist Church. He was 8 years old when that had blown up. And this is a scene of it. A KKK bomb went off and killed 4 little girls and blinded a 5th. He said that was all he could think about. And all those bricks back here, he had laid by hand. He was a mason, and he said every one of those is like a piece of me. Why am I showing you a restroom? Not only a restroom, but a really kind of ugly, scroty looking restroom. Well, this was a site where a young man named Samuel Youngie was murdered. It was a whites only bathroom. He attempted to use it one evening, and the gas station attendant shot him. The Bryant store and meat market in Money, Mississippi, is being swallowed by nature, and it will be gone. It was where Emmett Till allegedly whistled at the shopkeeper, a young woman. Just about 7 years ago, she admitted that the whole account was false, and he had done nothing. Yet he was thrown off this bridge after being brutally beaten, and his body washed down to the Tallahatchie River. This is Black Bayou. And when it was found, the authorities in Mississippi wanted to bury it or burn it as soon as possible to avoid the news and notoriety that it would bring. Mamie Till, in an act of indescribable courage and vision, insisted that his body be brought back to Chicago for an open casket public funeral. She said, "I want the world to see what they did to my baby." And that helped propel the NAACP and the modern civil rights movement forward. Rock Springs, Wyoming once had a thriving Chinese community. It was completely leveled in 1885, and there's no trace of it left. What happened in Rock Springs was of particular importance because it propelled other communities with Asian populations, particularly Chinese, to assert their own white supremacy and drive the Chinese out. It happened all across the West. Once again, ephemeral places that disappear. This was once the Summers Hotel and Subway Lounge in Jackson, Mississippi. Back during Jim Crow, as I think most of you know, it was difficult to impossible in the entire country, especially the South, to find a place to stay safely if you were African American. This was one such place, and because jazz musicians who were Black couldn't find places to stay elsewhere, they stayed here, leading to the proprietor creating a lounge. And it was a legendary place in its day. Another example in Mississippi of, I'll just say, a Green Book lodging. A whole vast number of legendary people stayed here at the E.F. Young Hotel. This is a railroad hotel in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Railroad hotels were places where Black people who were working for the railroad or traveling on the railroad could stay. And this was right along the tracks. Recently, I went to Topeka, Kansas. I was trying to find a way to illustrate the Brown versus Board of Education landmark court case. And I was struggling because everything I saw was a recreation. And I happened upon, at the suggestion of somebody from the National Park Service, I was able to talk my way into this, which was the judge's chambers for the first trial in the Linda Brown versus Board of Education litigation, in which the Topeka Board of Education was given the right to continue separate but equal, as was the case in the United States at that time. 3 judges sat in here and decided that historic case. This is the one of the first schools for African Americans in the United States. The African Free School was actually founded by several of our founding fathers. But when you walk by it in Greenwich Village now, you wouldn't know what had once been there. This segregation wall was actually the first image I shot for this series, and I didn't know I was doing this, the Ghosts of Segregation. At that time, I was working on something a little not quite as painful, but I stumbled upon this, and the bartender who was giving me the tour of this saloon, when I asked him to explain what I was seeing, he said, "Oh, that's a segregation wall. My grandmother had to sit behind it until 1965. He was a young Hispanic man." I'm going to just zoom through a few more places because I know we're running late. And I do go on, don't I?
Take your time, Rich. This is all really fascinating.
Well, thank you, Audrey. The suffering of the African American community because of oppression and discrimination was not the only emotion that they experienced. There was joy and celebration. It had to be found in a different way than those of us who are white. And this was once a hotel with an adjoining club for jazz in South Carolina. And after a hurricane, it became economically unviable. So it's just a ghost in this verdant, swampy area now. This is what is called, or was called, the Black Eden. Idlewild, Michigan, is a community that in the 1920s welcomed Black people to buy property, rent cabins, and it was one of the few resorts where African Americans were welcome. The painful fact of our racist history is that it was not limited geographically. It extended all over the country. I live in Seattle now. I've lived there for 44 years, and it was just about 2 years ago that I discovered this door was the segregated entrance to the Moore Theater. I had stood in lines for the Rocky Horror Picture Show, for rock concerts, right by that door, and never had a clue. And few people know it. This, with the tragedy of George Floyd and the rising of consciousness and the BLM movement, when I saw this marquee, I thought, this is a powerful and poignant symmetry. I have a lot of segregated entrances. This is in Kilgore, Texas. This was the doorway in which George Wallace stood to bar the entrance of the first 2 Black students to the University of Mississippi. I mean, University of Alabama, forgive me. There's an interesting history here. Shortly before this event, which became known as the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door, James Meredith had been enrolled at the University of Mississippi. That led to bloodshed and great violence. And George Wallace had aspirations of becoming a national political force. He knew that he needed to polish his credentials. So he had his people contact the Kennedy administration and tell them there will not be any violence at the University of Alabama, but I'm going to be barring the entrance, and this became theater. There was no serious violence in Tuscaloosa when this occurred, but that night, Byron de la Beckwith waited for Medgar Evers to come home and assassinated him in his carport. Medgar had been watching President John Kennedy address the nation, a rare thing at the time. And the White Citizens Councils and the KKK were doing everything they could, including murder, to maintain white supremacy. I think I need to wrap this up. I'll say this was the most moving, painful, frightening image that I have made for this project to date. This is the scene where James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman were killed outside in Neshoba County, Mississippi, outside Philadelphia. I remembered this clearly from my own childhood, and I thought these men exemplified courage. They were trying to register people to vote and do something good, and I want to do something good too. So I guess I'll figure out where the stop screen share is.
You got it.
Okay, good.
Wow, Rich, I want to just begin by thanking you for a tremendous presentation of your extremely powerful project. And I'm so thrilled that it has garnered the support of the Guggenheim Foundation, and that you will have this publication, and that hopefully through both the book and this continued support of your work, it will find its way to more audiences, because it is such important work that you're doing. And you speak so eloquently about not only your pictures, but about the history that you are so dedicated to unearthing. I wanted to begin with a question about impact. I think you spend so much time really looking at and revealing to us these what would otherwise be invisible markers of an extremely both painful past and a painful present, as you noted, and as all of us are aware from the ongoing events in America. A lot of these racial issues are ongoing, and we have not found a solution. You're showing us that so many of these markers are right in front of your eyes, and it calls to mind a lot of the work that Marion Palfi was doing. She specifically said that she wanted to affect social change and legislative change, and made sure that her photographs were circulated in spaces that would enable them to do that. And so she shied away from art museum walls, and instead advocated for kind of library exhibitions, or would make books that she made sure would pass under the eyes of lawmakers and social justice advocates. And one question I have for you is kind of twofold. What is it that you hope that viewers take away from your work? And kind of partnered with that, what do you believe that photography's impact can be today, and through what channels?
Well, that's a very good question, Audrey. I think that the main goal for me is to raise awareness that this history is everywhere, that nobody is without sin, that and that it is ongoing. I want to foster conversations between people of different views in how we can address this. And I really am moved by the courage that I have seen in people, both living and dead, in confronting this. I too believe that these pictures need to be seen like Marion's broadly, and not just in the sort of beautiful but elite confines of museum walls. So the debut exhibition of the traveling show, Ghosts of Segregation, is at an art center in Lawrence, Kansas, where the whole community comes in for dance lessons, art lessons, theater presentations, and they have a magnificent exhibition space as well. It's not just people who are familiar with museums, and that is really critically important to bring it forward to everybody.
Yeah.
And that's my answer.
That brings up for me another question, and it would be so lovely for every person encountering any one of your photographs to have this gift of your time and your voice. But you and I have talked in separate spaces before about the role of language in your work. Just as you say that so many of these markers of our histories of segregation today are invisible. Looking at your photographs today, for example, Ed's DriveIn, or any of these images of doors and architecture, or or nature, a viewer without the gift of language might not know what they're looking at. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of words or language in presentations of your photographs.
Well, words are critical. They provide context. My background is as a photojournalist, and I always strive to make images that told the full story as best an image could. Now I'm ironically intentionally working in an area where the images are so obscure and enigmatic, and these images require context, which is why there are lengthy information placards by each one. And I think because they're carefully written by somebody else, they're more eloquent than me. But you need to know those benches were a place of suffering, yeah. that grassy spot outside Laramie, a young man was killed. So that comes across in the captions, the words. It's real, but I also want this sort of obscure nature of the images to remind us to open our own eyes where we live. I think that along with that conversation that I want to foster about racial and social equality, I want to foster curiosity. I think that curiosity may be more important than knowledge, because speaking for myself, some of the things I think I know are fallacious. They're built on myths. And so I try and apply a certain degree of curiosity in every moment. And I think if people do that and really are patient, or in looking at their surroundings, or delve deeper into local history, one can be amazed at all the things that you've taken for granted that are right there where you live.
Absolutely. I maybe just want to press on that point a little bit more. And I think you said something really interesting about that you used to be interested in a kind of photography that told you everything just in the image. And in this series, I think it plays on a really interesting dynamic, because in that moment between seeing the photograph and then coming and reading a label or a title or a caption, you as the viewer are too brought into that dynamic of first not knowing and then knowing what you're looking at. And it almost calls attention to our own blindness before offering that revelation. It brought up for me, your sort of commitment to revealing what has been covered up or what has become inscrutable, that in a way we can see photography in general as a medium that grapples with revelation, and that asks us to look more closely and engages with the surface of things, but in order to show us more. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the way that your work engages with those issues of invisibility.
Well, I think that understanding the significance of not only places, but historical events is urgently needed. I think that we have well, the phrase is, history repeats itself, because we don't spend enough time gathering information. At least that's one of the I'm attributing. Well, I think that I'm having a moment.
That's okay.
The assumptions that we make of what is around us is detrimental to our being informed, truly informed, and making good decisions. If we want to change the nature of our social structure, we need to inform ourselves of our history. And it isn't that history repeats itself, it's that we forget our history, or it isn't taught fully.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Rich, sorry.
I was just going to say, we fall back into familiar patterns and habits, and that's what I want to help alert us to.
Yeah, and
so we can have a different future than our past.
Absolutely. I wanted to pivot a little bit to ask a question that I am sure that many of our viewers are also wondering, and that's if you could talk a little bit more about your process. And I mean that in two ways. On the first level, I mentioned in my introduction of your work that each photograph of yours is actually the result of many, many photographs that you stitched together. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that formal technical process. But on the other hand, I think probably even more interesting to our viewers is your research process, because so clearly each of your photographs is the result of a deeply extensive process of planning and historical research. I feel so much of the spirit of Marion Palfi in that respect. She called herself a social research photographer and would spend years and years at a time researching a community, or in order to make a small set of pictures that she would circulate along with her extensive reporting. So if you could just talk a little bit about that process for you, how it is that you come to find, gain access to, and unveil the sites that you ultimately photograph.
Well, I'm just celebrating today the 105th day of my road trip to try and complete this project, or at least the first version of this project. And I know that finding the places that I have visited over those 105 days and the remaining probably 30 involved much more time than I'm spending photographing. In the past, every day that I'd be out shooting represented about a week of research. And I use a whole variety of sources to find these locations. I go to, I read a lot, first off.
Clearly.
I use other online resources like blackpast.org, and the Equal Justice Initiative has a tremendous website, eji.org. And I consult with local historians. Another resource is going to historical preservation societies in different cities and states. Some states have quite phenomenal resources. If you just like Mississippi, I found so many things from their historical preservation website.
Oh, wow.
So that helps guide me. And yet I struggle with it because I know I'm not an expert. I'm just, as I
It's
said
almost as
before,
though you make yourself an expert newly with each new picture that you take on. I mean, there's a really, you speak with a profound depth of knowledge about the histories and the sites that you are photographing.
well, I try and immerse myself in it because I'm each one of these pictures is seriously a tribute, in my mind, a tribute to the people who were there, not just the place, perhaps the place least of all, but the human beings who struggled on those spots. I believe in a fashion there those are ghosts embedded in the bricks and mortar and dirt and trees. And I want to do as I want to honor those people. Now, you asked about my process, and I do shoot. The technique is generally known as stitching. I will find my my viewpoint and set up my camera on a tripod with a special head and photograph hundreds of overlapping images. Sometimes I'll do that over the course of a few hours. Sometimes it's over months. I'll keep returning to a place to see how things have changed and get nuances in light that the picture of the Moore Theater in Seattle, while it looks rather like one image, I was there for at least 6 hours trying to capture the light changing and blending that all together. Yet it is of critical importance to me as a recovering photojournalist that my images are actually authentic to the place. I don't change anything other than utilizing the passage of time. I imagine that the details are of critical importance, even if I don't recognize what that critical importance is. I want to capture as much of it as I can. So I shoot in this way, and it allows me to make truly immersive size prints. My goal is to not only have all that detail so granular, but to have the person who's viewing the picture forget that they're standing in front of a photograph
Mm.
and feel, at least for a moment, like they are standing in that place.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's really incredible to imagine. I mean, and now that you say that you're on day 100 plus of your road trip, imagining that hours and hours of really labor put into over so many days making these photographs. It's incredibly powerful. It's a very different model of photography than a kind of handheld camera street photography. And clearly your labor, it pays off in these incredibly powerful images. Rich, when you and I first met, you expressed delight and curiosity about our doing an exhibition on Marion Palfi, and I think shared, as so many people have who have had a chance to see the show or know about it, the sentiment that it's unfortunate that more people don't know about her body of work. That said, you have talked about other photographic influences of yours. There is, of course, a whole history of photographers who had been dedicated to civil rights and social justice. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about who those influences on your work have been.
Well, it's been really broad, and many of the people who influenced me may not be familiar to anyone else, but I think as a kid, getting the Chicago newspapers, I would see the work of a particular photographer, John White, who I thought created incredibly powerful and often socially significant images. And that helped drive me towards considering a career as a photographer. Gordon Parks, every week when Life came out weekly, I would devour it and see aspects of life that were not familiar to a white kid growing up in suburban Chicago. Eugene Smith was a tremendous influence on me in telling stories of great importance and emotional depth. And, the range of images produced by the Farm Services Administration and the WPA during the Depression really stuck with me. And I should give a shout out. Marion Post Walcott photographed a scene of a Black man ascending a staircase to the so-called colored entrance at the New Crescent Theater in Belzoni, Mississippi. And I had found that theater still existed. The stairway still existed, not as photogenic as in Marion's photograph from 1939, but she educated me to look for clues.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I'm trying to do. So I was actually driving to Belzoni from Houston, and I passed through Kilgore. That picture I kind of blew by of the Texan Theater. I recognized what it was because of Marion Post Walcott.
Wow.
I don't make these assumptions and pass them on as truths. I photographed it because I was so convinced, and then I spoke with the journalist in Texas who had grown up in Kilgore and could verify that that's what it was. When I asked the few people I could talk to in Kilgore, either they didn't know or they didn't want to say. It is.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and we must have a degree of shame for the horrendous treatment we've shown to people who are considered the other, whether it's Black or Asian, gay or trans. I mean, anybody who has ever felt like they were an outsider deserves to be let inside, I think.
Well, I think that's such an important message. And I want to wrap up our conversation with one final question. And that is, with all of your experience as a photographer and the different avenues that has taken you in, and of course, this most powerful and important current undertaking of yours, what, if any, advice would you give to a young, new photographer today setting out on a journey, hoping to document the world that they are seeing around them and hoping to make a difference. Is there any advice that you would impart?
Well, as I said, be curious, be patient. Think about what it is you want to investigate and spend a lot of time in that investigation, both reading and scouting and talking with people who might be related to your area of interest. I learned so much from just spending time on location, like talking to Holiday Stone or Ernest Hines. It gives me a broader perspective. And I think really listening, really being compassionate and empathetic uh, are the keys, and being patient. The things don't happen quickly. If they're going to be good, rarely is it a sudden revelation. It takes time.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing with us your tremendous body of work, this ongoing project. I want to encourage everyone out there to try to go and see Rich's very powerful photographs in person. I have had a chance to see some of his prints in person, and they're just spectacular and beautiful and very powerful. When your book is published next year, I hope that many of you out there watching will have a chance to get your hands on a copy. And I want to thank our viewers and our patrons of CCP and Phoenix Art Museum for all of your support, for joining us for this wonderful talk. And I hope you will also have a chance to see our Marion Palfi exhibition before it closes. Thank you so much, Rich.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank everybody who's been watching.